All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Laura Kearns. I'm with the Ohio Division of Wildlife, and I'm just going to take you through a little introduction to some Ohio sandhill crane biology for the Ohio crane count. So first off, what's so special about sandhill cranes? Well, they are one of Ohio's largest bird species. They're also were once extirpated from Ohio and have made a comeback. They returned to breeding in the state in the 1980s, and they are still listed as a state threatened species. And finally, they're also interesting because they're a migratory bird, and even though they breed here, they can migrate in the winter as far south as Florida. And we have, at the Division of Wildlife, tracked some of our breeding sandhill cranes all the way to Florida. So how do you tell a crane from other birds? Well, really the only other bird that you might mistake a sandhill crane for would be a great blue heron. So we have two photographs here, sandhill cranes on top and the great blue herons on the bottom. So I'm just going to point out some different characteristics between them. So first of all, the sandhill crane usually stands with its neck outstretched, and it also has a red cap. That's really distinctive for the sandhill cranes compared to the great blue heron in the bottom. It does not have any red on it. They often sit or stand with their heads cocked, so they don't stretch out their necks as far, or there's sort of a little bit of a curve in the neck. Other things that you can tell them apart, the sandhill cranes, when they're breeding, they tend to be in pairs. And they tend to be very secretive during the breeding season, and they nest in territories. So you'll have a pair, you'll have a nest, and they sort of patrol that territory. Great blue herons, on the other hand, are colonial breeders. So you'll often see, or you're most likely going to see, great blue herons nesting in a colony in the trees with other great blue herons, and but then they go off and they have solitary foraging territory. So a lot of times you see them alone. So that's one difference. And another difference is that oftentimes when you see them flying, the sandhill cranes will have their necks outstretched, their legs trailing behind, whereas the great blue heron, and they'll be in groups, whereas the great blue heron will be usually flying by itself, and it'll keep that head cocked during its flight. So looking at those neck shapes in flight is very helpful for distinguishing between the two. The only other thing I want to mention in this picture here, the sandhill crane actually has some brownish color to it, and that's sandhill cranes paint themselves, and that might be to assist with camouflage, especially during the breeding season. It helps them blend in better. So that brown is actually mud, but their plumage is really gray. And then the only other thing I want to mention is that the sandhill crane is only one of two native cranes, and the other whooping crane here that's native to North America is white. So be very unlikely you would get those confused. Whooping cranes are still incredibly rare. They've only been sighted here in Ohio very rarely in the last few years, and they are taller and of course would stand out more because of the white. Another thing I want to mention about sandhill cranes, and that's really important for the crane count, is knowing their vocalizations. So there's two main calls that they make. The first is called a guard call, and usually that's just a single bird making sort of a rattling type call. So if you hear that, that would indicate you have at least one crane. The other type of call, especially that you might hear more often in the spring during breeding season, is called a unison call, and it's like a duet. So both the male and female do this call at the same time in unison with one another. So in order to hear some examples of those, you can either go to the OBCI website. We'll have examples of those calls posted there. Or if you have the Merlin, Cornell's Merlin bird identification app on your phone, there are also sounds that you can tap on for Sandhill crane and familiarize with those sounds. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about Sandhill crane breeding phenology here in Ohio. And really March is when Sandhill cranes have come back from their wintering locations and are starting to get on territory and begin courting one another. And one thing that they do is a dance. And this is another thing that makes them really interesting species to watch from that perspective, is just watching their dancing behavior. They'll hop up and down. They have kind of characteristic poses, and they'll usually do this with their mate to kind of form that mating bond. So then later in March or in early April, they'll begin nesting. Again, that nest will be a platform nest on the ground, and usually in some kind of wetland area. But then they'll lay 2 eggs. 2 eggs is the most common. And then they begin incubating, and that incubation period lasts for about 30 days. And then in April and May, the chicks hatch. Here's a photo of a really cute fuzzy chick. They're super cute when they're young. And so they hatch from the nest, and they're a precocial species. So they're pretty much able to walk as soon as they hatch. So they'll then follow their parents along during the next 60 days or so, and they grow up really fast. So in the middle here, you see a juvenile crane. There's 2, actually. There's a juvenile here in the middle and then one on the right. You can notice they don't have the red on their heads. So that's how you know they are juvenile birds. But yeah, they're almost as tall as their parents in 60 days. So very fast growth period. But they stick around with their family. The parents help feed them. They teach them how to hunt and to be a crane. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the population of Sandhill cranes. So the eastern population of cranes is doing really well. As I mentioned before, they were extirpated from Ohio at one point, and they were nearly extirpated throughout their range in eastern North America in the 1930s. But then in 1986, in 1986, their numbers as a population here, the eastern population of Sandhill cranes was about 17,000 birds. So from that period of extirpation in the 1930s, they had grown to 17,000 birds, but their growth has continued, and in 2020, it estimated around 95,000 birds in the eastern population. However, they're still state threatened in Ohio, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So 1926 was the last nesting record in Ohio. That was in Huron Bog in Huron County, where this black star is. And then in 1987, the first new record of breeding in Ohio happened in Wayne County. And this was an unassisted record, or an unassisted nesting. We did not do any kind of reintroduction of Sandhill cranes here in Ohio. They just started coming back on their own. And the population has continued to grow very slowly at first, but has nonetheless continued to grow over time. So in the mid-1990s, we only had a few breeding pairs in Ohio. And then as we got into the 21st century, that population slowly began to grow, and then has continued up until the early 2020s. And so to help track this population, this is why we're doing the Ohio crane count, to try and get a better estimate of where our population is.